You no longer fit into our strategic realignment, Maya said over a grainy Zoom call. Her tone was corporate smooth, detached. Your department will be merged into broader operations. My name is Evan Cordell, 45 years old, Senior Innovation Director at Solaris Gridworks in Seattle, Washington. For over 11 years, I'd shaped frameworks, led teams, and helped transform us from a scrappy renewable startup into a serious force in smart grid technology. I didn't protest, didn't flinch. I asked about the transition package, nodded, and ended the call. Professional until the very last click. It was 22 days ago. Now I sat in my apartment's corner workspace, scanning the non-compete clause in my contract. The language was vague, intentionally so. The legal team from our new parent company, Altrovia Energy, had cut corners. Maybe they assumed no one would challenge them. They were wrong. My phone buzzed. Another message from Renzo, one of our best engineers. You were right. They're gutting everything. Are we still doing that thing we talked about? I didn't reply. Not yet. Timing mattered. The press had called the acquisition a milestone for innovation. But behind the headlines, real innovation was quietly being buried. And me? I wasn't angry. I was focused. Sometimes the best thing they can do is push you out. If you've ever been underestimated or replaced by someone who doesn't understand what you built, like, subscribe, and share this story, you're not alone. The acquisition was hailed as a strategic win. Altrovia Energy, a Fortune 500 giant, absorbing our agile operation at Solaris Gridworks. Industry press lauded the synergy, calling it a visionary alignment. Within a week, the cracks showed. Maya Chen, the newly installed division's CEO, sent out a cheerful memo promising minimal disruption and a deep respect for Solaris talent. 8 days later, the first round of layoffs blindsided 2 engineering teams, mine included. I kept quiet, observing. Back in my apartment, I opened the folder labeled Contingency. Not because I had expected to be fired, though the signs were there, but because I'd felt it for months. A shift. A pull toward short-term performance metrics, away from long-term vision. I remembered the moment our executive team accepted Altrovia's buyout, too fast, too eager, as if they'd been waiting for permission to cash out. Poured a coffee and stared at the whiteboard in my kitchen. Still, there were the names of Solaris's top clients, their problems, and the systems we had built. Systems Maya's people didn't understand and were about to dismantle. Below that, I'd written 5 names. 5 engineers. 5 people already texting me the same question. What's next? I didn't know yet. But the answer was coming. I joined Solaris Gridworks back when we were just 11 people packed into a refurbished warehouse near the Seattle waterfront. The founder, Gerald Lin, had the vision, a smarter, more adaptive energy grid, but he lacked the technical roadmap to make it real. That was where I came in. I wrote the framework, designed the system core, and led the team that built our first functioning prototype. 80-hour weeks, cold takeout, whiteboard ink on my sleeves. My marriage didn't survive it. You're married to that company, my ex-wife said during our final argument. And she wasn't wrong. I'd had offers, bigger salaries, fancier titles, from well-funded firms in Silicon Valley. I turned them all down, because Gerald made me believe this was ours. This is your company too, Evan, he'd say, clapping me on the back after investor demos. We never signed equity agreements. No official stake, just a verbal promise. When we succeed, so will you. It wasn't legally binding, but I built my loyalty around it. And then, 3 years ago, Gerald stepped back due to health complications. His daughter Maya took over. MBA, sharp suits, polished language. But she didn't have her father's fire. Where Gerald saw breakthroughs, Maya saw acquisition potential. That's when the mission shifted, quietly, but unmistakably. And I felt the ground begin to move beneath my feet. The shift wasn't immediate. It crept in through quiet meetings, changed KPIs, and Maya's new favorite phrase, "Let's make ourselves attractive to strategic partners." I tried to speak up. In leadership meetings, I raised concerns. "We're sacrificing innovation for optics," I said once, after a particularly painful budgeting session. Maya smiled, nodded politely, and said, "Let's circle back to that." We never did. 6 months ago, I overheard a conversation through the glass wall of conference room C. Maya and 2 Altrovia executives were going over redundancies. My department led the list. That night, I went home and dusted off the sketches I'd started a year prior, ideas for a new kind of platform. Something bolder, something unshackled by corporate bloat. I renamed the file Pinnacle. I didn't stop contributing at Solaris. I kept delivering results. I trained younger engineers, improved documentation, and stayed ahead of every deadline. Because if they kept me, I would have stayed. But if they didn't, I'd be ready. 2 weeks before the call with Maya, I was suddenly cut out of strategy emails. My access to planning dashboards disappeared. Still, I acted normal. I finished every pending report. And 2 days before they let me go, Maya requested full access to all of my system maps and projections. I gave her everything. Promptly, clearly, professionally. They underestimated what else I had prepared. The Zoom call had lasted 7 minutes. Maya recited the script smoothly. Transition support, severance terms, HR follow-up. She didn't know I was already typing. As she outlined my offboarding, I sent a message to Renzo. Time to talk about that project. Dinner at my place. Tomorrow. 7 p.m. 5 engineers came. Every single one of them had the same story, sidelined, ignored, their innovations shelved without explanation. They weren't angry. They were restless, waiting. We sat around my dining table, sketches and laptops spread across the wood, old Solaris blueprints mingling with new ideas. I listened more than I spoke. I needed to be sure. The turning point wasn't a fiery speech or a dramatic vow. It was a simple look, passed between teammates when one of them said, "We can build something better." I didn't disagree. The real confirmation came a week later, during Altrovia's first division-wide presentation. Maya stood on the Solaris stage, the same one where we'd once celebrated product launches, and announced the transition plan. Solaris systems will be phased out over the next 18 months as we integrate with Altrovia's enterprise architecture. I looked around the auditorium. Engineers I had mentored stared at the floor. No one clapped. They were killing what we built. And I realized then, the question wasn't if we build something new. It was how soon. That night, I opened the file I'd renamed Pinnacle. It wasn't just a sketch anymore. It was a roadmap. I created a secure messaging group with the 5 engineers who'd gathered in my home. "If you're serious about building something better," I wrote, "I have a proposal. Discretion essential." Every response came back within minutes. Variations of yes. Over the next 3 weeks, my apartment became our unofficial war room. Evenings were spent whiteboarding weaknesses in Altrovia's platform, identifying the clients most likely to be affected by the integration, and outlining the strengths of the Solaris architecture we had helped create. We weren't trying to recreate Solaris. We were going to evolve it. carefully, ethically, legally. I used my severance package to lease a small office on Capitol Hill and filed paperwork under the name Pinnacle Grid Systems. The name mattered. It wasn't just a title, it was a direction, a declaration that we weren't trying to compete at the bottom. We were going to rise above what Solaris had become. The day my final paycheck from Altrovia landed, I received a message from Maya. "Heard you're starting something. Let's talk before you make any hasty decisions." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. The next morning, I gathered the team at our modest new office, a converted studio on the third floor of a building that still smelled like paint and possibility. I shared the message from Maya, her vague attempt to talk things through. They didn't laugh. They didn't need to. Instead, I pulled up a document on the monitor, a list of potential early clients, companies still using Solaris systems, now being pressured into Altrovia's outdated infrastructure. At the top of the list was North Bay Utilities, a regional provider we had customized a monitoring platform for 3 years ago. I'd led that project myself. I knew every inch of their system, every demand, every compliance requirement. Altrovia would never meet those specs with their template solution, and North Bay wasn't the only one. We cross-referenced implementation schedules, mapped pain points, and projected failure windows. It was all happening faster than expected. Then came the hard part. "Are you ready to walk away tomorrow?" I asked the room. One by one, they nodded. We weren't just leaving jobs. We were walking away from a legacy that had been corrupted. By nightfall, all 5 had submitted their resignations, and Pinnacle was no longer an idea. It was real. The day after our resignations, I arrived early at the office. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows across the empty street below. On my desk sat a framed photo from a decade ago. Me and Gerald, grinning beside the first Solaris prototype, wires everywhere, a mess of triumph. His arm was slung over my shoulder like a proud older brother. That photo reminded me what this was really about. Not revenge, not ego, legacy. We spent the next 2 weeks moving fast but quiet. We finalized our development environment, built a secure code base from scratch, and ran every line through legal checks. I wasn't going to give Altrovia a single excuse. Then a call came in. Harper Mills, Director of Ops at North Bay Utilities, a name at the top of our prospect list. He sounded frustrated. "Altrovia's integration team doesn't understand how our systems were customized. They keep pushing standard modules that don't work for us." I scheduled a demo for the following Tuesday. When Harper saw what we'd built, familiar in spirit but light years ahead, he signed a contract before the end of the call. We had our first client. We didn't celebrate. We got back to work. 2 days after Harper signed, I received a certified letter from Altrovia's legal team. Allegations of breach of contract, claims of intellectual property theft, a formal demand to cease all Pinnacle operations immediately or face litigation. I had expected it. I forwarded the letter to our attorney, Marielle Yates, a meticulous strategist who had reviewed every clause of my non-compete before I ever signed it. She called that evening. "They're bluffing," she said. "The non-compete is overly broad, and they can't prove any proprietary material was copied. Let them make noise." Still, we weren't naive. We didn't have Altrovia's war chest. A prolonged legal fight could drain us. So, I took a different approach. I reached out to Maya. She agreed to meet, likely thinking she could intimidate me into folding. The next day, I walked into Altrovia's new downtown office. Modern, gleaming, soulless. The Solaris logo was now a footnote in the corner of the reception wall. "This can't continue," Maya began, before I'd even sat down. "Your platform is built on work you led here." "No," I replied evenly. "It's built on what your team discarded." She leaned forward, all corporate warmth gone. "We can offer you a consulting contract. 2 years. Excellent compensation." There it was, a golden cage. I stood. "Thanks, but we're just getting started." Her jaw tightened. I walked out. Not because I was unafraid, because I was finally free. Altrovia didn't wait long to retaliate. Within 48 hours of our meeting, Harper called. His voice was tight. "They're threatening to audit our entire infrastructure and void our service agreement if we move forward with you," he said. "Our legal team's spooked. They want to pause everything." By the end of the day, we lost 3 potential clients. Just like that, our runway shrank from months to weeks. That night, the team gathered at the office. No one said much. The energy was heavy. I stood by the window, city lights flickering in the distance, and then opened my inbox. A new message waited. "Gerald Lynn." Subject line, "I've been watching." His message was brief but sharp. They didn't just buy Solaris's tech. They inherited its liabilities. Call me. I looked at my team. Altrovia is focused on crushing us, but in the process, they're neglecting the clients they promised to serve. I paused. Gerald says they're already having system failures. We know those systems better than anyone. Renzo nodded slowly, realization dawning. "And when things start breaking?" I smiled. "We'll be ready to catch what they drop." We met at Gerald's lake house just outside of Tacoma, far from boardrooms and NDAs. He moved slower than I remembered, but his mind was razor sharp. He laid out documents across the dining table, each one marked with internal memos, timelines, and flagged emails. "They didn't just acquire Solaris for the tech," he said, tapping a page. "They bought it for the Cascade Grid Authority contract." My pulse quickened. Cascade was our biggest client, a tri-state utility provider with a highly customized infrastructure. I had led that build. 4 years of deep integration, regulatory calibration, and endless iterations. Altrovia had promised them a seamless migration. But the schedule in Gerald's documents showed a 6-month timeline for a system that had taken us nearly half a decade to stabilize. Even worse, internal emails dismissed key requirements as non-essential customizations. "They're going to force Cascade into a generic framework," Gerald said. "It won't hold." "And when it breaks," I added, "they'll face compliance failures and performance penalties." Gerald nodded. "And they're trying to bury you before that happens." I leaned back, absorbing the implications. This wasn't just a business play anymore. It was a countdown. Driving back from Gerald's lake house, I kept replaying one line in my head. They inherited obligations they can't fulfill. It made sense now. Altrovia's aggressive legal threats, the rushed audits, the consulting offer. It wasn't about protecting IP. It was about delaying the inevitable. They knew the Cascade contract had teeth. What I hadn't known, what Gerald revealed, was that the agreement I negotiated years ago included strict uptime guarantees. Anything below 99% performance would trigger massive financial penalties. Altrovia had no clue what they'd walked into. Back at the office, I called Renzo. "Get the team in tomorrow at 7 a.m., I said. "We need to begin development on a Cascade-compatible architecture, quietly, carefully, and fast." "Are we going after them?" he asked. "Not yet," I replied. "But when their system starts to fail, They'll come looking for a solution. We'll be ready before they even realize it. There was no more waiting, no more hesitation. We had 8 weeks before their first migration milestone, and I planned to meet it before they did. The next 8 weeks felt like one long, sleepless sprint. We split into rotating shifts, turning our small office into a 24/7 development hub. Diagrams covered the whiteboards, energy drinks stacked beside laptops, and the sound of quiet determination filled every corner. Our goal was clear: build a platform that could slot into Cascade's unique infrastructure without disrupting their operations. And we had to do it in complete silence. No outreach, no leaks, just readiness. Meanwhile, Gerald worked his network. At conferences and panel discussions, he began raising questions. What happens when enterprise integrations ignore customization? Can large-scale migrations truly protect utility compliance? He never mentioned Pinnacle. He didn't need to. People in Cascade's orbit were listening. By week 5, the first crack appeared. 3 of Cascade's substations experienced data sync issues, just as we'd predicted. Their CTO, Nina Alvarez, issued a neutral public statement: expected migration friction. But word reached us that behind closed doors, she was furious. 2 weeks later, the second rollout caused a 4-hour analytics blackout across an entire grid zone. And then, Cascade sent Altrovia a formal notice of deficiency. The countdown wasn't theoretical anymore. It had started. Altrovia responded exactly as we anticipated. They blamed the outages on legacy architecture, on the very systems we had built at Solaris. It was a setup, a legal positioning strategy. If they could shift the blame, they might dodge the performance penalties embedded in the Cascade contract. But we had receipts. I spent the next 2 nights drafting a detailed technical report, mapping every failure point back to Altrovia's forced integration layers, not the original Solaris foundation. Gerald reviewed it, made a few surgical edits, and hand-delivered the document to Nina Alvarez. 3 days later, a message appeared on my phone. Coffee? Tomorrow. 2 p.m., Westlake Cafe. Signed only, N.A. I arrived early. Nina was already seated, no small talk. Your analysis matches our internal findings, she said, sliding the folder across the table. They're trying to force us into a generic box. We can't risk the compliance fallout. You have options, I said carefully. Do I? I paused, then pulled a flash drive from my coat pocket. This is a full overview of Pinnacle's Cascade-compatible system. Ready in 3 weeks, no downtime. She pocketed it without looking. And for the first time in this whole journey, I saw something in her expression. Hope. 2 days after that quiet meeting at Westlake Cafe, Altrovia made a move. They issued an urgent press release announcing a temporary stabilization protocol for Cascade's grid infrastructure. Translation: their integration plan had failed. Their stock dropped 8% by market close. That same evening, Pinnacle received an official request for proposal from Cascade's executive board, bypassing their normal procurement process under emergency authority. We didn't celebrate. We got to work. The team gathered in our narrow conference room, eyes wide, exhausted but focused. This is it, I told them. Everything we've prepared, everything we've built, it all points here. Renzo looked at the others, and then back at me. Do we need to worry about what Altrovia will do when they realize we've secured the deal? I didn't hesitate. They can try whatever they want. But we didn't cause this crisis. They did. And now, we're the only ones with a solution. The board vote was set for Thursday at 10 a.m. We hit send on our proposal at 9:46. And we waited. The call came at 10:45 a.m., barely 45 minutes after submission. Unanimous approval, Nina said without preamble. Full implementation starts Monday. I didn't speak right away. I just let it settle. Within the hour, our legal team confirmed the contract was clean. No traps, no vague clauses. Cascade had not only agreed to our full proposal, but also included a 3-year maintenance agreement, and most importantly, an indemnification clause shielding us from any legal interference by Altrovia. They knew Altrovia's non-compete threats wouldn't hold. By mid-afternoon, the news had spread. Pinnacle Systems to lead emergency grid stabilization at Cascade. Altrovia's stock slid another 12%. Desperate, they filed for an emergency injunction to block the contract, citing familiar claims: proprietary tech, breach of agreement. The hearing was set for Monday morning, exactly when our team was scheduled to begin deployment. I wasn't rattled. I'd prepared for this. Let them come. We weren't just ready. We were already in motion. The conference room was stark, the long glass table reflecting the cold fluorescent lights overhead. Maya sat at one end, impeccably dressed, her eyes sharp but tired. At the other end, I sat alone, the weight of the past months pressing against my chest like a physical thing. She didn't waste time. Evan, we both know why we're here. Pinnacle's growth has become a serious threat to Altrovia's strategic plans. Your aggressive expansion into Cascade and other key accounts is undermining the integration we've fought so hard to complete. I let her words hang in the air for a moment. Maya, I didn't start Pinnacle to undermine anyone. I started it to build something better, something you abandoned. Her eyes narrowed. You talk about abandonment. But what about loyalty? You turned your back on the very company that gave you a chance. I met her gaze steadily. Loyalty isn't blind obedience. It's about shared values and respect. When those disappear, so does loyalty. She took a deep breath and leaned forward. We can still find common ground. Altrovia is willing to negotiate a partnership, a way for Pinnacle and Altrovia to coexist without needless conflict. You have the talent, the innovation. We want to channel that energy constructively. A flicker of old memories crossed my mind. Gerald's vision, the early days of Solaris, when we believed in something greater than ourselves. I exhaled slowly. Partnership means trust, Maya. And trust can't be forced or bought. Her expression softened for a moment, but resolve returned quickly. This industry is changing, Evan. We can either adapt together or be left behind. I smiled faintly. Then maybe it's time you learned what building from the ground up really means. The meeting ended without a handshake, without promises. But as I stood and walked toward the door, I felt lighter than I had in months. Because this wasn't the end, it was the true beginning. Outside, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the quiet shift happening inside that room. I stepped into the sunlight, ready to build the future on my own terms. Monday morning, Federal Courthouse, downtown Seattle. Altrovia had 4 attorneys seated at the front, polished, rehearsed, flanked by binders and quiet confidence. Maya sat behind them, her expression unreadable, jaw tight. We had one attorney, Marielle Yates, precise, calm, and utterly unshaken. The judge reviewed both filings, then looked up. Altrovia's non-compete refers to proprietary systems built during Mr. Cordell's tenure, she said. However, the evidence presented shows Pinnacle's architecture was developed independently. Furthermore, Cascade's filing outlines a compelling public interest, reliable utility infrastructure. She closed the folder. Injunction denied. No debate, no delay. As we walked out into the hallway, Maya intercepted me. This isn't over, she said quietly. Altrovia doesn't lose. I met her gaze steady. "This was never about beating you," I replied. "It was about building something that works." Then I turned and joined my team. We didn't cheer. We didn't high-five. We got in the van and drove straight to Cascade. Because while they were still playing defense, we were already deploying. 18 months later, Pinnacle occupied the entire 4th floor of a downtown Seattle building. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay, sunlight pouring in as our team reviewed the latest system diagnostics. Cascade's platform? Rock solid. 0 downtime since launch. Regulatory compliance? Exceeded. Word had spread. 4 more major clients migrated to Pinnacle within a year, not because we were the loudest, but because we delivered. Altrovia, unable to recover from the failed integration, quietly scaled back its energy division. Maya was reassigned to a subsidiary in Phoenix. Gerald stopped by from time to time. He never asked for credit. Just stood in the corner of our open workspace, arms crossed, nodding as he watched lines of code become real-world solutions. He didn't need to say it. This was the company he had hoped Solaris would become. And Tyler? Last I heard, he joined a startup accelerator. Maybe he'd learn what leadership looked like. Too late to matter here. One morning, as I reviewed final specs for our newest rollout, I opened my inbox to find an unexpected message. From my old boss at Solaris. "You built something better than we ever could," it read. "Some of us saw the shift coming but couldn't stop it. Just wanted you to know, some victories take time." I leaned back, eyes closed. This one had been worth every second. That evening, I stepped out onto the deck behind my home. Just me, the breeze, and the silhouette of the mountains that had witnessed it all. The anger I once carried had dulled. What remained wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. Altrovia's arrogance, Maya's dismissal, the loss of Solaris. They'd all been catalysts. Without them, Pinnacle might have stayed a file on my laptop, an idea whispered over dinner. Now, it was a thriving company built on integrity, clarity, and earned trust. Inside, my team was still celebrating the successful rollout of our latest module. Laughter floated down the hallway. But out here, in the quiet, I thought about what we left behind, what we'd rebuilt. I glanced at the framed photo in my study window, me and Gerald, a decade younger, sleeves rolled up, grinning like idiots beside a tangled prototype. Back then, we believed in something. And somehow, through everything, we'd found our way back to it. Sometimes being pushed out of the wrong place is exactly what it takes. To find the right one.